The Bible hero we're going to look at today is Joseph. And I wanted to make a little distinction here because there actually are several Josephs in the Bible. And so this is the Joseph with the coat, the multicolored coat, not the Joseph that we talk about around Christmas. Okay, so there is a distinction there. But looking at the story of Joseph, you'll see, if you're just looking at it at the surface, that in many ways Joseph is an Old Testament picture of Christ. And we see these parallels that God is put into the story. In fact, Joseph was betrayed. He was sold for silver. He was dead to his father through no fault of his own, but because of the sin of others. And ultimately, this all resulted in the salvation of the ones who betrayed him and the salvation of many people and nations. And so you see these parallels between Joseph and Christ. And there's these pictures, even in the Old Testament, pointing to Jesus. Everything does eventually point to Jesus. So Joseph, though, is a well-known hero. He's one that even people who maybe have never read the Bible would recognize. They might have seen the movie or seen the play. I mean, there's actually a play about the life of Joseph. And of course, he's known for his multicolored coat. He's known for his prophetic dreams and his ability to interpret dreams. And so you see all of these things about him is pretty common in our society. However, all those major details for his story, while they're nice and they're good and they're important, the heart and soul of Joseph's story, what makes him a Bible hero, is that he was a man of faith. He was a man of faith. No matter what happened in his life, he kept his faith in God. He trusted in the Lord. He trusted him and he obeyed him. And as a result, God turned the worst things that could possibly happen, the worst, most terrible things that could happen in a person's life, into a miraculous story of salvation for his people. God took these difficulties and turned it into the path of doing his will, his plan for good. And so we will notice right up front, Joseph had a rough life, but we will see that everything in Joseph's life, no matter how difficult it was a part of God's plan for good. And we should learn from this dynamic because it works the same way for us as well. This is Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. We are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared ahead of time for us to do. See, God has a plan for each of you. He has a plan for your life. You are not an accident. You are not a mistake. You're not a happenstance. You are a planned creation by God, and he has a purpose for you. You are valuable to him. And he has good works that he wants you to do. Not just any good works, the good works he planned and prepared ahead of time for you to do. It's not an accident that you're here today. God has a purpose for your life, a plan for you. And this dynamic is key to what we find in the story of Joseph. God had a plan for him. So Joseph enters the Bible in Genesis chapter 30, and like all of us, he enters life not knowing his plan. I mean, we don't know what God's plan for us, but God does. But he enters the life, Genesis chapter 30, when he's born, and he becomes the main character of the book in about chapter 37, which is pretty much from then on, the story is about Joseph. And of course, Genesis is the story of God's people, and we see it go through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then on to Joseph. So today we're going to try and condense this whole story of Joseph, all of those chapters, into about 30 minutes, right? An hour? Hour and a half, okay. We're going to try and get it in about 30 minutes, which isn't necessarily easy to do. But we actually looked at the complete life of Joseph about 2 years ago. So some of you may remember that. If you're not, the videos are available on YouTube, and we did a whole series on the life of Joseph. So for today, we're going to keep focused on how Joseph was a hero used for God's plan for good. But let me give you some background leading up to that part of the story. Joseph was the 11th of 12 brothers. He also had a sister, but 11th of 12 brothers, which means he had 10 older brothers. Now, right there in the story, you know he's going to have a rough life, okay? He's got 10 older brothers. That's trouble enough. And that is where a lot of the trouble comes from. We'll find the family dynamic. Joseph was also his father's favorite son. Even though he was the 11th in birth, he was the first born of his favorite wife, Rachel. And you'll remember the love story of Jacob and Rachel, how he fell in love with Rachel and he worked 7 years in order to marry her. And his father-in-law, Laban, pulled a fast one and switched sisters on him at the wedding. So he actually married Leah, and which is a good reason. If you're getting married, don't marry a girl that has a veil you can't see through. Okay, just okay, you want to see what you're getting into. But he married Leah, and then wound up afterwards complaining, and he said, well, this is the way it works, and so now you can marry Rachel after 7 more years work. And so he works, and so on. Rachel was still Jacob's favorite wife, and Joseph was her son. And so that made, in Jacob's eyes, Joseph the most important son. It was his favorite. It was the one he considered the firstborn. And this favoritism was going to become a source of a lot of the trouble in Joseph's life. Joseph's only younger brother was Benjamin, who was also born of Rachel, and their mother died during childbirth having Benjamin. And so that's what Jacob clings to. So in chapter 37 of Genesis, where Joseph becomes the main character of the story, it begins with his father giving Joseph this special decorative coat. And some have referred to it as a coat of many colors. It probably did have lots of colors and ornamentation to it. It would have been an ornamental robe, something like royalty would have worn, a prince would wear, and probably had long sleeves, making it difficult for him to do any work. Now, I tried to find pictures of what I thought this might look like, and the best I could come up with was the dress on from the Princess Bride. Remember her with the long sleeves? Not necessarily exactly but you've seen pictures of kings and royalty with their robes and how they have these long sleeves that loop and drag. It probably was something like that, because Joseph wasn't intended to go out and do labor. Okay, you can't do labor in a dress like this. Okay, you try and do the dishes, it's going to get in the water. You try and do it, it's going to knock things off the counter. You can't do. Joseph would have been wearing that type of robe, and it was a symbol that Joseph was to be in charge. He's not the common laborer like the other brothers. Now imagine if on Christmas morning, 10 of you have 11 boys, 10 of them get work tools for their work on Christmas morning, and the other one gets toys. How are they going to feel? Okay, you see the dynamic brewing. There's a problem here. And so after getting this new coat, after all of this happens, he gets this new coat, and Joseph begins having prophetic dreams, showing that one day his brothers will all bow down to him. And in his youthful wisdom, he shares these dreams with his brothers. Says, hey guys, guess what I dreamed? You're all going to bow down to me. Now, this is probably the closest thing I have to criticism of Joseph, but sometimes you just got to know when to keep your mouth shut. Okay, just because you have it doesn't mean you have to tell everybody. There was once a wise man who said nothing. That can be wisdom sometimes. So all of these family dynamics are happening, but what makes the family dynamic even worse, if it can get worse, it gets even worse. Jacob tended to use Joseph as the person to give direction to his brothers and to go check on them. He was the foreman and the company spy. And so Jacob would say to Joseph, hey, go check on your brothers, see what they're doing, give them these instructions for me, and bring back a report. Joseph's 10 older brothers didn't take any of this very well. Well, how would you feel? How would you feel if your younger teenage brother was put in charge of you, given all the easiest work, all the best clothes, and Dad really did love him best? How would you feel? Then on top of that, your little brother, the same one, starts telling you dreams saying that your destiny is to bow down to him. How would you feel about that? Well, his brothers weren't so happy. In fact, Joseph's older brothers did what most older brothers would want to do in that situation. They planned to kill him. Okay? Lots of older brothers feel that way. There are a lot of times where lots of older brothers feel like they want to plan to kill their siblings. The difference in this story is these guys actually do it. Okay? They don't just feel that way, they want to get rid of it. Which kind of tells you the level of hatred and animosity that was going on here. So one day when Joseph was sent out to check on them, they threw him in a pit. They took hold of him, they threw him in a pit, and they planned to leave him for dead. But the opportunity to make some money off the deal came up. So they went with that plan instead. I mean, why kill your little brother if you can make money off him? Sell him off. There was a caravan passing by that was on its way to Egypt, so they sold Joseph as a slave. They pocketed the money. They put blood from a goat on Joseph's coat and took it back to Dad and said, "Hey, look what we found. Is this your son's coat?" They made Jacob think he was dead. So there was Joseph. There was Joseph, a slave on his way to Egypt, sold by his own brothers. What had happened with all of God's promises? The promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What had happened with the dreams God had given Joseph? His life seemed like it must have been over. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you've been there where you're asking, God, what happened to what you promised? What happened to what you were doing? So that's where Joseph was, probably with every step he took towards Egypt. And when he arrived in Egypt, Joseph was put up for sale. He was purchased by Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, and Joseph was made one of his household slaves. Now, how would you feel if you were Joseph? See, I imagine we would feel hopeless, helpless, betrayed, depressed. Like life was over, like God himself had broken his promises. Now, what's interesting in the story of Joseph is we're never told anything about how he felt. We can only imagine that part. What the Bible tells us is what Joseph did, and even more importantly, what God did. What God did. So in Genesis chapter 39, verse 2, we read this. It says, "The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, serving in the house of his Egyptian master." The Lord was with Joseph. See, his circumstances did not mean that God had abandoned him. Quite the opposite. God was very much at work in Joseph's life. The Lord was still with him, even in slavery, even in betrayal, even in all the difficulties he was facing. The Lord was with him. And it's a good thing for us to remember, just because you're going through a hard time doesn't mean you aren't where God wants you to be. Just because things didn't work out the way you planned them doesn't mean they aren't working out the way God planned them. And so God made Joseph very successful. Now, he was a slave, but he was a successful slave. So much that Potiphar, his master, put him in charge of running his whole house. And that makes sense because Joseph already had management experience. Okay? I mean, he already knew how to boss everybody around and how to be over the other servants. You almost wonder, did he put his experience with his brothers on his resume? Hey, Potiphar, I can run this. And there could be worse jobs in the world than managing the house of a rich, high-ranking government official. Even in his struggles, even in his hurt, the Lord was with Joseph. But see, his story was far from over. Success almost always brings temptation and trouble. When you've won a victory, guess what? There's always another battle coming. And what we find as we continue in Genesis 39, dropping down to verse 6, back half of the verse, it says this, "Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after some time, his master's wife looked longingly at Joseph and said, 'Sleep with me.' I'm sure to a lonely young man, a slave far from home, this must have seemed tempting. But he would not. He feared the Lord. He honored God. He would not betray his master. He refused this woman's temptations. And no matter how much Potiphar's wife begged, we're never told her name. I guess we could call her Mrs. Potiphar. No matter how much she begged, no matter how much she went at her advances, he ran from them. Joseph had integrity. But they say there's no fury like that of a woman scorned. Well, that's what we see next in the story. Joseph wouldn't give in to her constant advances, so she accused him of attempted rape, and Joseph was thrown in prison. So first Joseph sold as a slave by his own brothers. He's carried off to a foreign land, and now because of his boss's wife, he's thrown in prison, presumably with a life sentence. It's actually interesting that Joseph was thrown in prison, because this crime in ancient Egypt, a slave attempting to rape his master's wife, was a death penalty crime. Okay, Egyptians were not very generous. They didn't have a very progressive penal system. Okay, you did something like that, they killed you, and usually quite brutally, which kind of makes everyone think that Potiphar didn't actually believe his wife. I mean, he knew her. He knew what she was like, and so he didn't really believe it, but he also couldn't keep Joseph there. I mean, matter of honor, he's got to, do something, so he throws him in prison. And that's what we see. Joseph gets thrown in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Where was God? Where was God when he was being falsely accused? When he was doing the right thing and went to prison for it? Where was God? Where were all of God's promises and the dreams God had showed him? I mean, how would you feel if you were Joseph in that situation? I don't know about you. Prison is one of those things I don't think I'd like. Okay? Nothing else, the food's probably really bad. And actually, in the ancient Egyptian prisons, I'm sure the food was really bad. What would you do? Joseph remained faithful. Even in the worst circumstances, Joseph remained faithful. And this is what we see in Genesis 39, picking up in verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. He granted him favor with the prison warden. The warden put all the prisoners who were in the prison under Joseph's authority, and he was responsible for everything that was done there. Joseph continued to be faithful, and God continued to bless him so that he became the prisoner in charge of all the other prisoners. God blessed him, even in those difficult circumstances, even in literally the pit. God was still there with him, still there blessing him, still there working in his life. And Joseph remained faithful. Joseph didn't give up. He didn't look at the difficult circumstances around him. He focused on the Lord, and he kept doing what was right. And while Joseph oversaw the prisoners, one day 2 special prisoners came in. The Pharaohs had sent them. It was his baker and his cupbearer. Okay, Pharaoh sent these guys in. By the way, being on Pharaoh's staff could be a dangerous job. Okay, that is kind of a dynamic with the ancient kings. Each of these guys, while they were there in prison, the cupbearer and the baker, had a dream. And they told Joseph their dream. They were downcast and they were like upset, and Joseph saw it and he said, "Hey, what's wrong with you guys?" Of course, maybe it's because we're in a prison. But, he's, "What's the matter today?" And they tell him their dreams, and he accurately interprets to both what their dreams meant. The baker, he said, was to be executed, and the cupbearer was to be exonerated, both of which would happen on the day of Pharaoh's birthday party. By the way, just an interesting historical note, there's only 2 birthday parties in the Bible, and in both cases, somebody gets killed. Their parties were a lot rougher. We settle for candles. I like our traditions better, but you do see that in the Bible. So, but it happens exactly the way Joseph said. And Joseph asked the cupbearer to remember him. "Tell Pharaoh about me," he said. When you are exonerated, when the Pharaoh puts you back in your job, remember to tell him about me interpreting your dream. Remember, because I've done nothing wrong. I'm an innocent man. I didn't do anything wrong enough to be deserved to be a slave, and I certainly didn't do anything to be in prison. That's what Joseph says. But the cupbearer, once he got back to his job, forgot all about Joseph. At least for the moment. He forgot. So there can come a time in your life where you're in a situation that isn't very fun. You can wind up in a place you don't want to be in. And no matter how hard you try, you just can't seem to get out. That's where Joseph was. But what we need to notice is the correct response for the believer is don't struggle. Instead, wait on the Lord. Put your trust in the Lord. Wait on Him to act. And it may be that, like Joseph, God has you right where He wants you. May not be where you want to be, but it might be where God wants you to be. Maybe He is setting you up to be in the right place at the right time for His good purpose in your life. And it may take being in an uncomfortable place today so that you'll be in the right place tomorrow. So as a Christian, when you are in a situation that only God can get you out of, it's time to kick back and wait on Him to get you out of it. And when that time comes, be ready. Be faithful and be ready. Because God is the one who shuts the door that no man can open, and He's the one who opens the door that no man can shut. Trust Him to open the door. Well, that's where Joseph was. There he is in prison. He's interpreted these dreams for the baker and the cupbearer. Everything happened exactly as he said, and he's waiting. And he winds up waiting for 2 years. 2 more years pass by. Can't you imagine for Joseph that was a long 2 years? Being in prison, waiting. But after 2 years, Pharaoh had a dream. Pharaoh had a dream that no one could interpret. He went to his magicians. He went to his priest. He went to his wise men, and none of them could explain the dream. And at that moment, the cupbearer remembered Joseph. Pharaoh was searching everywhere for someone who can tell him what this dream means. And the cupbearer remembers, oh, wait a minute, I know a guy. He finally remembers Joseph. He finally tells Pharaoh about Joseph. And Joseph was instantly rushed out of the prison. He was cleaned up. He was given new clothes, and he was taken before Pharaoh. And so here's some good news for us. There's no prison on earth that God can't get you out of if He wants to get you out of it. God is not limited. It's a matter of when it's His time, when it's His purpose. So Joseph goes and he interprets Pharaoh's dream that no one else could dream, which was a warning that there would be 7 years of plenty. There'd be a plentiful harvest like they'd never known in Egypt, lots of food, but that would be followed by 7 years of famine. And Joseph takes it upon himself to also proceed to tell Pharaoh how to deal with the problem. He says, Pharaoh, this is going to be your problem. What you need to do is appoint someone to be in charge of all the food collection. And you collect the food during the good years and store it for the bad years. This is an interesting character dynamic of Joseph's character. He had no problem telling people what he thought. Okay? He had those dreams. He told his brother, well, here he is standing before Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world. He walks right out of prison and says, hey, Pharaoh, this is what you need to do. It's an interesting dynamic in Joseph's character. But Pharaoh was actually so impressed. He saw clearly that God was with Joseph. I mean, how he can interpret the dreams that none of my priests could interpret, none of my magicians could interpret, and he even knows how to solve the problem. And so he puts Joseph in charge. He puts Joseph in charge of the land of Egypt, making him second to only Pharaoh himself. Joseph had been a slave and a prisoner, and now he was second in command of the most powerful nation on earth. Yes, God really can take you from the prison to the palace in one day. Never underestimate what God can do if you are walking in His plan. But Joseph was given power, he was given wealth, he was given servants, he was given a wife, and they had 2 sons, and life was good. And Joseph kept his faith in God. No matter what God happened, he believed in God, and God was faithful to Joseph to bring him through even the worst circumstances. Now, this would be a good place to have one of those Joseph lived happily ever after, right? I mean, God brought him through all of this, and we could close the story here, but that's not the end of God's story. See, all this was just the setup. This was the beginning of what God was planning. Remember, God had given Joseph dreams showing him the future, and God still had dreams that he planned to fulfill. God had given promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God still had promises he planned to fulfill. Plans for good that he was working in Joseph's life. So the interpretation of the dreams, of Pharaoh's dreams Joseph gave him, came true. It was exactly as he said. There were 7 years of plenty. Joseph supervised it. They collected all the extra food and stored it up for when the bad years were going to come. And then the famine began. Famine like they'd never known. And they had the food available so that he could feed all of the people of Egypt. But not only that, they had enough food available that the nations around them began to come to Egypt and come to buy food. And Joseph made Pharaoh powerful, wealthy, beyond anything anyone had ever known before. Egypt became this superpower of the ancient world. And everyone was coming to Joseph for food. But one day some people walked in that he recognized. 10 guys. Yes, it was Joseph's brothers. They walked in. And he recognized them, but they had no clue who he was. Now, remember, the last time they saw Joseph, he was a teenager being carried away into slavery. As far as they know, he's dead. And Joseph would have been at this point an Egyptian official. So he probably, Egyptians tended to look, one of the dynamics of Egyptians is they tended to shave everything. They tended to have no hair. I mean, they shaved everything. And so he would have been made up with that. He would have had the goatee thing that they stuck on and the headdress and all the makeup. And so they probably wouldn't have had any clue who he was. He spoke to them through an interpreter. There was no way for them to know. But he recognized them. So was it payback time? Here they are, the guys who sold them into slavery. He had questions. What had happened to their father? It's been a long time. Is dad still alive? Could he trust them? Were they the same or had they changed? Would they now come and mess up his new life? Now, we're not told what Joseph thought or what Joseph felt. We're just told what he did. Okay, the Bible tells us what he did. So what he did is he accused his brothers of being spies and he threw them in jail. I kind of wonder if he didn't put them in the same cell he had to live in. I mean, be certain justice to that. But after 3 days, he puts them in jail for 3 days. After 3 days, he let all but one of his brothers go home with food. Okay, take this food home to your families. And he keeps Simeon in jail. I'm not sure why he picked Simeon. I mean, maybe he was kind of next in line. There's a whole reason for that. But he picked Simeon, puts him in jail, and told them that they won't let Simeon out unless they bring back their little brother, according to their story, Benjamin. Because they had told him, we have one more brother. So they go back home. They take the food. They tell Jacob, that we got the food, but the man in Egypt was very harsh, and he won't let us have any more food. And they arrested Simeon, and they won't let us have any more food unless we take Benjamin back with us. But Jacob's not going to allow that. Remember the dynamic, the family dynamic. Joseph was Jacob's favorite because he was the first son of his wife Rachel. Well, Benjamin is the only son left of his wife Rachel. And if you think he was protective of Joseph, he's become 10 times worse with Benjamin. He had become very protective of his youngest son. And his brothers thought getting rid of Joseph would solve the problem of being dad's favorite, of how dad treated us. But all it really did was transfer that favoritism from Joseph to Benjamin. It didn't fix their problem. In fact, it made it worse. Jacob wasn't willing to send Benjamin to Egypt. He was willing to sacrifice Simeon rather than do it. The problem is they were out of food. Okay, the whole world was facing famine. And so when they ran out of food, he had to choose starvation for all of us, or I risk sending Benjamin. And so he finally gave in. And all of Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him. Now, doesn't it seem like we had that dream somewhere, where Joseph said, all my brothers are going to bow before me? The day came. The day came. God fulfilled the dream just like he said. Now, it wasn't the way Joseph probably thought it would happen. It wasn't the way the brothers thought it would happen, but it was the way God planned it to happen. So Joseph accepted them. He brought Simeon out of the prison. He prepared a banquet for them. But it seems that Joseph still wanted to test them. To test them. Had they really changed over the years? So he hid a silver cup in Benjamin's sack. And he sent them off, and after they had gotten out of the city, he sent his men after them to say, hey, somebody stole my cup. Whoever it was has got to come back in due time. He did this. He set them up to see maybe how they would react. When caught, it's interesting, when they were caught, all of his brothers, all of them, offered themselves up in Benjamin's place, particularly Judah. But it says first, all of them said, hey, keep us. We'll stay as slaves. Because they didn't want to go home without Benjamin and see their father grieved again. They didn't want to repeat what they had already been through. Apparently, they had learned something from their experience. So at this moment, Joseph can't take it anymore, and he weeps, and he reveals who he is. And he sends for his father to come and live with them, and he makes up with his brothers, and they all move down to Egypt, and they live there for the rest of their lives, surviving the famine. Now, that's also a good spot to end the story, right? I mean, happy ending. They can live happily ever after, but you know what? God's still got more going. God's not done yet. Joseph did not hold a grudge against his brothers, even after all they had done to him. He had his whole family moved down to Egypt. He took care of his brothers. He took care of their families, of their children. He provided for them the best of Egypt. However, when Jacob died, they did fear that he might take revenge. And that's where we reach, I think, the meaning behind Joseph's life, where he explains God's plan. And we're going to pick up here in Genesis chapter 50, beginning in verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said to one another, if Joseph is holding a grudge against us, he will certainly repay us for all the suffering we caused him. So they sent this message to Joseph. Before he died, your father gave a command. Say this to Joseph. Please forgive your brothers' transgression and their sin, the suffering they caused you. Therefore, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when their message came to him. His brothers also came to him, bowed down to him, and said, we are your slaves. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You planned evil against me, but God planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Therefore, don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your children. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. See, Joseph understood that his life was bigger than himself. His life was about God's purpose. His life was about God's plan, which was to put him in the right place at the right time to save many people. He saved his family. See, God's plan was to save the children of Israel. God's plan was to take them down to Egypt and make them a nation. God's plan was to save Egypt and these other nations from the famine. And God did all of that through Joseph because he was faithful and honored God doing what God gave him to do, even when it was hard, even when the circumstances were difficult, even when others planned evil against him. God turned it around for good. And this is the dynamic we started with looking at this morning. See, God has good works that he has planned ahead of time for us to do. God has a plan for good. No matter what tragedy has come into your life, God still has good for you. He still plans to accomplish good things through you. And ultimately, God has a plan for good for you to bring you safely into his kingdom. See, our plan, our life does not end at the grave here. It continues on into the glory of heaven with Christ Jesus because God has planned good for you. So let me ask you this morning, how will God turn things around in your life? Maybe there's things in your life where others planned evil for you. Maybe you've experienced that. Maybe there's things in your life where people deliberately planned to harm you. Or maybe just things where everything went south and it just did harm you. How will God turn them for good? See, I bet every one of us here this morning has something in our life we wish God would turn around. Something that's uncomfortable, something that's difficult, something that we don't like. And it might be the very thing God is using to grind us and chip us down to what he wants us to be, to mold us into the image of Christ. Or it might be the thing that God is using to move us into the right place for the right time for what he's planning. And you might say to me this morning, you say, well, my circumstances are impossible. I bet not. You know, not one of you this morning is stuck in an Egyptian prison. I mean, you might have rough things in life, but I bet it's not as rough as an Egyptian prison in the ancient world. If God can turn Joseph's life around and move him from the prison to the palace, he can take care of whatever you're facing. He can work in your life. There's no circumstance you're going to face that God cannot deal with. And your story is still being written. You need to make sure you keep faithful to God, keep faithful to his plan, no matter what, so that you're ready when he's ready to move. Well, what we find in the story of Joseph is that God's plan for good went far beyond Joseph's lifetime. That Joseph was faithful to be a part of that plan all the way to the end of his life. Let's pick up again in Genesis chapter 50, verse 22. Joseph and his father's family remained in Egypt. Joseph lived 110 years. He saw Ephraim's sons to the third generation, and the sons of Manasseh's son, Machir, were recognized by Joseph. Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will certainly come to your aid and bring you up from this land to the land he swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Joseph made the sons of Israel take an oath. When God comes to your aid, you are to carry my bones up from here. Joseph died at the age of 110, and they embalmed him and placed him in a coffin in Egypt. This is something about Joseph. He was a man of true faith, and we need to take notice of this. He was the ruler of Egypt. He had wealth and power, but what mattered to him were God's promises. What mattered to Joseph were God's promises. Guys, don't let the things of this world distract you. Even if you're successful, even if you have wealth and power and family and all the good things in the world, and there's a lot of things God might bless you with, that's wonderful. Enjoy it. It's great. But don't let it distract you from God's promises. So what mattered to Joseph were God's promises. And God had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that their descendants would inherit the promised land. God had told Abraham that his descendants would be slaves in another country for 400 years. Joseph knew this. Joseph believed those promises. And by faith, he made his family take an oath. When God comes to your aid, when God fulfills his promises, take my bones with you. He believed God's promises because he'd lived it. He had seen it in his own life. No matter what you see in circumstances, understand when God says it, God will do it. Joseph had lived that. And now here he is, ready to die. He says, I'm banking myself on what God's going to do 400 years from now. You take my bones with you. That's faith. So do we have that kind of faith? Do you plan your life, your future, based on God's promises? Now, I'm not just talking about today, okay? Yes, I planned my life today on God's promises. I showed up at church. Amen, brother. Right? I'm here. Now, I'm not talking about just that. Have you based all your life on God's promises right to the day you walk into the throne room of heaven? You're going to keep basing it on His promises. You're going to be faithful to what God's called you to do. You're going to be trusting His plan for your life. See, because God has made promises. He has promised that we will be with Him, that Jesus has gone to prepare a place for us. We have those things, and we have God's Word. Have you based your life on these promises the way Joseph did? The way Joseph did. See, we should never plan our lives on just what we can see or on our feelings. Feelings are deceptive. They come and go. We should never plan our lives just on our experiences. Our experiences are limited. But instead, the way to be a part of God's plan for good, for our good, for everyone's good, is to base our life in faith on God's promises. To be faithful with whatever He gives you to do, wherever He gives you to do it. No matter what life throws at you. And guys, sometimes life will throw things at you. And it'll hurt. But you keep being faithful. You keep trusting God. You keep your eyes on Jesus. You keep carrying the cross until He fulfills His promises. So as we go into this week, let me ask, how are you trusting God? How are you being faithful to keep doing what He's given you to do until He fulfills His promises?